Theodore Roosevelt after 1912 is often looked at as a passing thought in modern American politics. He lost, and America subsequently began its political shifts into Republican conservatism and Democratic progressivism. But many Americans forget about the real last ride of the bull moose, that of the 1920 presidential campaign. Before his passing in January 1919, Theodore Roosevelt had spent the last couple years of his life being a critic of the Wilson administration and increasingly becoming involved in American politics yet again. By his dying days in late 1918 and early 1919, Theodore Roosevelt had not only reconciled his differences with the Republican establishment, but also became the man for which Republicans wished to run in 1920. To understand how this happened, it's important to look at how Theodore Roosevelt's career went after his loss in 1912 until his death in 1919, and see the development of this reconciliation unfold as it did in history, through time and gradual progress. Like how he toured Europe in 1909 and 1910 after leaving the White House to his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, Theodore Roosevelt took a trip with his son, Kermit Roosevelt, and other scientific observers on a natural expedition of an unnamed river of Brazil from 1913 to 1914. During this time, Roosevelt suffered a leg injury, leading to him developing a tropical fever, leaving him on the footsteps of death itself. For several weeks, he would be left a cripple and delirious, unable to continue the journey down the river. Yet, in spite of all of these life-threatening troubles found in the uncharted territories of the Amazon, Theodore Roosevelt emerged with the expeditionary crew, albeit 50 pounds lighter. Coming back to the United States in May 1914, he found the country like he did when he returned from Europe, in an entirely different place than when he left it. Roosevelt returned to the limelight, however, not just as an accomplished navigator of the now discovered and named Rio Roosevelt, or Roosevelt River, as it's known as today in Brazil. However, interestingly a note, Theodore Roosevelt did not return to his political crusade immediately. He instead sat back for a little bit and observed this new America. Woodrow Wilson, whom Roosevelt shared a bit of similarity towards when it came to the reforms he wished to implement in 1912, was at first fairly impressed with Wilson's accomplishments in passing the Income Tax Amendment to the Constitution and the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. However, the ever-keen Roosevelt always found problems with each of his successors when he returned to America from each of his foreign trips. In the case of William Howard Taft, there had been several perceived missteps. There was the firing of Theodore Roosevelt's friend, Gifford Pinchot, as a result of the dispute that he had with Department of the Interior Secretary Richard Ballinger, which would later be called the Ballinger-Pinchot Affair. Theodore Roosevelt had seen this as a betrayal of his conservation legacy. Another thing which struck Theodore Roosevelt was William Howard Taft's wholesale approach to trust busting in a legalistic manner through the courts, which rejected Theodore Roosevelt's system of the maintenance of good trust and the dissolution of bad trust, which he had employed throughout his presidency. There was also the Payne-Aldrich Tariff, passed in 1909, which Roosevelt and other progressives viewed as a sellout tariff to appease the conservatives in the Republican Party. With Woodrow Wilson, the problems which Theodore Roosevelt felt most repudiated by regarded foreign policy. Initially, it was the original terms of the Thompson-Uredia Treaty between the United States and Panama, negotiated in 1914. This treaty included language in which it expressed regret in the way in which the United States gained the Panama Canal via supporting Panama's independence war in 1903 against Colombia. Theodore Roosevelt viewed this as a direct insult to him, as he took great pride in being the president to secure America easy access to the Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, Democratic detractors, notably the likes of William Jennings Bryan, who was at that point Secretary of State under the Woodrow Wilson administration, believed the treaty to be a conciliatory measure taken to appease the Colombians as an attempt to restore relationships between the Colombian and American governments after this 1903 war. However, this would not be the main thing which Theodore Roosevelt would be famous for rebutting against Woodrow Wilson for. When the great powers of Europe went to war in July of 1914, Theodore Roosevelt, unlike other prominent politicians at the time, was an immediate supporter of the Allied powers, calling for restrictive measures to be taken against Germany. He would take the role of America's Cassandra, a prophecy teller from Greek mythology, calling upon the Wilson administration to begin preparations for entering the conflict on the side of the Allies. These calls would enter into further prominence as American shipping began facing harassment from the German unrestricted submarine warfare campaign, meant to choke off supplies to the British Isles and France, with Theodore Roosevelt outwardly campaigning against this violation of American rights and commerce, as he called it, in addition to his moral outrage over the depiction of German savagery in Belgium. Roosevelt's cries for preparedness would be further amplified when the Lusitania was sunk in 1915, showing to Americans that not only was Roosevelt increasingly proven correct in his assertion of intervention on behalf of the Allied powers, but also that Woodrow Wilson had not done enough to protect Americans. Wilson would continue to, in spite of Roosevelt's dismay, to look towards a memorandum of understanding with the German Empire, eventually getting a pledge from the Germans to stop the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign in 1916. However, with the growing influence of Theodore Roosevelt and other preparedness advocates, of the likes including General Leonard Wood, who was an old friend of Theodore Roosevelt's from the days of leading the Rough Riders in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, Wilson would essentially be forced to sign the National Defense Act in 1916 and the Naval Act of 1916 in an attempt to boost America's preparedness in preparation for a potential entry into the Great War. Theodore Roosevelt's criticisms did not stop there, however. In the 1916 campaign, in which he rejected the Progressive Party's nomination for president, which led to the party ceasing any political operations, Roosevelt supported the Republican nominee, Charles Evan Hughes, and actively stumped for him on the campaign trail. Several times throughout the campaign, Theodore Roosevelt harkened upon his distaste of the hyphenated American in several speeches in which he called out German Americans and Irish Americans, two groups which supported the Central Powers for various geopolitical reasons, and called them unpatriotic and unloyal to America. This was not necessarily unfounded in xenophobia, as German Americans in particular, during this time period, often displayed their pride in their German heritage. It was not uncommon, for instance, to see a bust or a portrait of Kaiser Wilhelm II in the houses of these German Americans, with a later Republican Senate Majority Leader during the 1960s, Everett Dirksen, remarking upon in an unfinished memoir of his, which would later be covered in biographies done on him, about how so-called loyalty commissions, established in his hometown of Pekin, Illinois, came into his house and attempted to force his mother, a German immigrant, to take down the portrait of Kaiser Wilhelm II in their living room, which she refused to take down, supposedly saying in response that America was a free country. Nonetheless, Theodore Roosevelt's idea of national pride and interventionism would continue to be swung into his continued criticisms of Woodrow Wilson until the United States finally entered the First World War in April 1917. Perhaps as a final disservice to Theodore Roosevelt, while Congress initially granted him permission to lead 4 volunteer Rough Rider divisions into Europe, President Woodrow Wilson will later come out to the press and explicitly denied Roosevelt from commanding these divisions, instead sending the U.S. Expeditionary Force under General John Pershing. Theodore Roosevelt, a man whose mental model to duty and service was framed from childhood as a necessary duty to fulfill, due to shame felt about his father, a man which he once called the greatest man he had ever known, for not signing up to fight in the American Civil War. This duty, which could not be held by him, would instead be passed down to his sons, with one of his sons, the youngest, Quentin Roosevelt, being killed in aerial combat during the Second Battle of the Marne. While Theodore Roosevelt and his wife mourned this death deeply, and it has been said by his family members to have actually hastened his own death, it did not stop him from his political crusade. Later, in 1917, Theodore Roosevelt would publish a book titled The Foes of Our Own Household, which would become foundational to understanding the Theodore Roosevelt which would later emerge to be the frontrunner in 1920. In this book, he wrote of his belief of the greatest threats to the United States not being foreign threats, but instead domestic subversives that enabled these foreign, at the time, German threats to take a foot. People such as pacifists, i.e. socialists, hyphenated Americans, predominantly German or Irish Americans were targeted, and the Wilson administration as a whole. Also of note was his particular targeting upon German American organizations and the German American press as committing moral treason. He believed the answer to this was Americanization by making English the only recognized language, which it still isn't today, by the way, and making people wholly American in identity rather than hyphenated. Ironically, his hero, Abraham Lincoln, talked about the same exact issue of foreign threats being less than domestic subversives in an entirely different context in a speech he gave to a men's club in 1838, in which he said, "At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher." While Theodore Roosevelt used this book as a way to highlight the dangers of these subversive elements, he also used it to push for a newer understanding of American society, which would frame the rest of his career. Theodore Roosevelt still believed in a lot of his new nationalism policies, which he pushed for in 1912, but with far more mature clarity to it. Theodore Roosevelt pushed for many positions of note here, which he believed to be necessary. First, the federal government was designed to continually mediate the interests of corporate monopolies and radical labor unions, the latter most likely in reference to the radicalism of the IWW, essentially creating an Americanized version of class collaborationism which he wished to install. Second, he called for many of the social welfare reforms like he had before, such as old age pensions, federally mandated accident insurance, maximum work hours, and a new proposal, corporate profit sharing with their own workers, in a sense, to have the workers also invested not just in the product, but in the country. Again, a class collaborationist take. Third, and less talked about, was his view on women in his ideal society. Contrary to the painting of Theodore Roosevelt today as a progressive icon, Roosevelt believed in a much more complementary role for women in American society. While he still believed in the idea of women's suffrage, Roosevelt also believed that the main goal of all women was to be homemakers and raising children, and that any of those who rejected their values while having the ability to do so to be parasite women. While he did not reject women in the workplace, viewing it as a necessity for some, those at home who had their husbands provide for them and still did not take care of their children were these parasite women. Last, and perhaps most interestingly, Theodore Roosevelt believed militaristic values and duty to be of the utmost of importance to American society. Roosevelt called for the institution of a year-long mandatory training program for all American men aged 19 to 21, regardless of class, to promote national solidarity amongst rich and poor. In this same part, Roosevelt also advocated for women to enter a year of national service, be it as nurses on the military front or as industrial workers in lieu of these working-age men unable to enter said industrial front. These ideas would continue to motivate Theodore Roosevelt for the rest of his life, and would also begin to put him back in the good graces of the Republican establishment, who had shunned him a few years before 1912. Even though holding the previously mentioned 1916 Progressive Convention in conjunction with the 1916 Republican Convention, Theodore Roosevelt was not fully welcomed back into the fold. While Roosevelt and the old guard establishment did not meet eye to eye when it came to domestic policy by many metrics, a lot of the issues which came to the forefront of the GOP and American politics now were foreign issues. This is where Theodore Roosevelt and the Republicans began to align a lot more, and would further open the doors to genuine reunification rather than a seemingly symbolic reunion of the dual Republican Progressive Convention in 1916. By 1918, as the war died down in Europe and the inevitable defeat of the German Empire was at hand, the Republicans were now focused on handling the aftermath of the Great War, and particularly the American involvement in the Treaty of Versailles. At the same time, the Republicans were also looking for a viable candidate to attract a victory for them in 1920. the Republican establishment, seeing Roosevelt's genuine commitment to reuniting with the party, including his support of Henry Cabot Lodge Sr., a prominent conservative Republican for the nominee in 1916, began to see him not just as a potential candidate, but the candidate. By the end of Theodore Roosevelt's life in 1919, he was viewed to be the inevitable nominee in 1920, for the first time actually being backed by the establishment as the undisputed candidate to run for election, rather than as a way to stifle his ambitions and progressive ideals by putting him as William McKinley's running mate in 1900, or the tacit support he received in 1904, and the repudiation and rejection of him entirely in 1912. This Republican Party in 1920 was willing to receive him in open arms and grant him the chance to rectify his wrongs which he believed he had committed by vowing to never run for a third term back in 1908. The last ride of the bull moose isn't talked about today in political history because it serves as a contradiction to the narrative of the simplistic takeover of the Republican Party by conservatives beginning in the 1920s. This view of history, the actual and real one, provides a rather unique what-if opportunity. What if Theodore Roosevelt had lived to see the presidency again? And what if in that term he served all 4 years? There is no doubt, after all, that a Republican would win in 1920 due to Woodrow Wilson's unpopularity and the Americans calling for law and order, which the steady and proven hand of Theodore Roosevelt could provide far more of in comparison to the eventual compromise candidate of Warren Harding. This also serves to paint a unique view of the bull moose himself and how his views evolved beyond the frozen image, which we have of him riding off into the sunset after 1912. The view we have painted today is that of a progressive icon by modern progressives and a statist by market-first conservatives and libertarians. But hearing Roosevelt's actual beliefs during the last few years of his life paints a different picture. He was a self-proclaimed radical, believing the tradition of Lincoln to be, in his own words, sane, constructive radicalism in promoting his ideals of what a modern America should be. At the same time, Theodore Roosevelt oddly lines up quite well with the canons of conservatism proposed by the likes of Russell Kirk in his 1953 book, The Conservative Mind. In other words, he was an oxymoron, or perhaps, a more real term, a synthesis. He was a progressive conservative. Though this served as a video to illuminate the last years of the bull moose, it also serves as a continual reminder to Theodore Roosevelt and his legacy as a great man of history, and how he still stands today, rightfully, as an American hero and legend.